The snow did not fall so much as it besieged Silverpine, a relentless, silent army erasing the world beyond the town's borders. It was the kind of storm whispered about in almanacs, a record breaker that transformed familiar streets into treacherous, white-walled canyons. Inside the old community hall, the air was thick with the scent of wet wool and pine boughs, a fragile pocket of warmth against the deepening cold. Every resident who had braved the short, blinding walk was now effectively trapped, the roads already impassable. They had come for the annual Secret Santa drawing, a tradition as dependable as the winter itself. But this year, the gathering felt less like a celebration and more like a last rally before the siege. Mara, the town's steadfast librarian and perennial organizer, moved through the crowd with a woven basket, her smile practiced and calm. The basket contained the folded slips of paper, each bearing a name. As hands reached in, laughter and cheerful speculation bounced off the high wooden beams, but the notes were tinged with a new, sharp-edged energy. People glanced nervously toward the bank of windows, now completely whitewashed by the driving snow, their thoughts already leaping to pantries and firewood. The act of taking a name felt weighted, a commitment made under duress. One by one, they plucked their destinies from the basket. Old Mrs. Gable peered at her slip, her lips moving silently. Tom, the realtor, tucked his into his breast pocket with a quick patting motion. Clara, Mara's assistant, held hers tightly, her knuckles white. The ritual was complete. They were all now bound to someone else in town by the anonymous promise of a gift, a small thread of connection in the growing isolation. The party dissolved quickly, the need to get home before conditions worsened, overriding the usual cider and cookies. Bundled once more in their snow-caked coats, they ventured back into the white fury, each clutching their secret. As the hall emptied, Mara was left with the hollow echo of departed voices in the empty basket. Outside, the wind howled, sculpting the snow into ever-higher drifts. In every quiet house, a person unfolded a slip of paper, looking at a name and wondering, with a mixture of holiday cheer and nascent unease, what they would give and ultimately what they would get. The first gift of the season had been given, a name, and with it, a silent, waiting question. For 3 days, the storm held Silverpine in a frozen, breathless grip. Then, as abruptly as it had arrived, the blizzard exhausted itself, leaving behind a world rendered pristine and silent, a diamond-bright landscape under a hard blue sky. The digging out began, and with it, the first gifts appeared. They were left on doorsteps and porches, wrapped in simple paper, often dusted with a fine layer of fresh snow as if they had materialized with the dawn. The initial offerings were benign, even heartwarming. Elsie Carter found a jar of blackberry jam and a loaf of sourdough, still faintly warm. Ben from the hardware store received a pair of thick, hand-knitted socks. The town exhaled, the tradition unfolding as it always had, a gentle exchange of small kindnesses that stitched the community tighter against the cold. The peculiar tension of the drawing night began to fade, soothed by the normalcy of scarves and sweets. The shift was subtle at first, a wrong note in a familiar song. Tom Abernathy found his gift on the third morning, propped against his front door. It was a large, rectangular box wrapped in a garish, metallic red paper that shimmered unnervingly in the winter sun. He carried it inside, his realtor's mind briefly appreciating the quality of the wrap. The box was heavier than he expected. He tore the paper away and froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a dollhouse, but not just any dollhouse. It was a perfect, meticulous replica of the old Victorian on Elm Street, down to the gingerbread trim. And the cracked finial on the leftmost turret. His hands trembled as he lifted the roof. Inside, the miniature rooms were exquisitely detailed, and in the corner of the master bedroom, spreading across the tiny floral wallpaper, was a patch of unmistakable black mold. A minuscule, handwritten inspection report lay on the floor of the dining room. The deal for that house had fallen through last spring after Tom, fearing the loss of his commission, had quietly buried the mold report from the potential buyers. A secret he had carried alone, now rendered in perfect, damning miniature on his maple breakfast table. Across town, Clara was unwrapping a flat, weighty parcel left inside the library's staff entrance. The paper was the same shimmering red. Beneath it was a book, encased in a protective sleeve. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she read the title, The Silver Stag, a collection of regional folklore. It was a first edition, exceedingly rare, one she had convinced herself had been lost in a flood decades ago. She knew every delicate line of its cover art. She also knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that it was the very volume she had slipped from the library's special collections 5 years prior, a theft born of desperate, covetous love, hidden now on her private shelf. The pristine book seemed to pulse in her hands, an accusation bound in leather and old paper. By week's end, several more of the metallic red packages had been delivered. Not to everyone, but to a select few. Each contained not a gift, but a curated artifact of private shame, a recovered gambling IOU for the diner owner, a replica of a forged signature for the notary's daughter, a bottle of expensive perfume for the minister's wife, identical to the one she'd taken from a guest's coat last Christmas. No cards accompanied them, no hints of the giver. The gifts were simply there, impossibly accurate, their meanings locked in the silent, horrified recognition of their recipients, the cheerful. Confusion of the first days curdled into a low hum of private dread. Doors were locked earlier, eyes darted away more quickly in the post office. The beautiful snow outside no longer seemed pristine but watchful, and the festive spirit of the season was replaced by a chilling, unspoken question that hung in the frozen air. Who knew and what did they want? The metallic red paper was the thread, and they were all hopelessly tangled in it. Mara called the meeting, her voice over the phone a study in controlled urgency. The community hall, still shuttered since the night of the drawing, was the only logical place. They arrived separately, their footsteps the only sound in the snow-muffled town square. Tom came first, his face pale above his scarf, the memory of the dollhouse vivid in his eyes. Clara followed, clutching her library satchel to her chest as if it were armor. Mara let them in with her master key, the heavy door groaning open to reveal the cavernous, cold darkness of the main. All they gathered under a single work light Mara had rigged near the small stage, their breaths forming quick, anxious clouds in the frigid air. No one suggested turning on the heaters. The space felt violated, the scene of a cheerful crime now haunted by its aftermath. Tom laid a folded square of the shimmering red paper on a folding table. Clara, after a moment's hesitation, produced her own from her satchel, the creases identical. Mara had received nothing, but she had seen the paper, on Elsie Carter's porch, on Ben's step, a lurid, festive scarlet that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. Seeing the two pieces side by side confirmed it. The paper was not just similar, it was the same. The same peculiar metallic sheen, the same almost imperceptible grid-like texture beneath the fingers, the same faint, coppery scent like old pennies and cinnamon. "It's a targeted campaign," Tom said, his voice too loud in the empty hall. The words echoed slightly, bouncing back at him. He wasn't talking about gifts anymore. He was talking about evidence. A tense silence followed, filled with the unspoken weight of their shared realization. The drawing had been compromised. Someone had manipulated the assignments, ensuring that the giver of these terrible presents knew exactly who would be most vulnerable to receive them. The basket of names, that sacred vessel of chance, had been poisoned. As the dread settled, it stirred up the past. In the quiet gloom of the hall, each was pulled into the private vault of their own conscience. Tom saw the young couple's faces again, bright with hope for their first home. He felt the slick, heavy folder in his hands, the damning report within. He heard his own voice, smooth as polished stone, assuring them the inspection had been clean. The memory of their gratitude, later transformed into bewildered betrayal when the mold was discovered, was a cold stone in his gut. His commission had been secure, their savings had not. Clara was back in the silent, dusty hush of the special collections room, the overhead light buzzing. The book, the silver stag, seemed to glow on its stand. Her fingers had trembled, not from fear, but from a want so acute it felt like hunger. The slide of it into her oversized bag had been a whisper, a secret shared only with the shadows. The lie she'd crafted about its misplacement had come so easily, and the thrill of private ownership had warmed her for months, until it slowly chilled into a constant, low-grade shame. Mara, watching them, was not immune. Her own memory surfaced, unbidden, a different winter, a different piece of paper. Not a name from the Santa basket, but a last-minute change to the town council grant application, shifting funds from the after-school program to the hall's new roof. Her signature, decisive. The roof didn't leak, the program had folded. She had told herself it was structural necessity over sentiment, but in the faces of the disappointed children, she had seen the truth. It was easier to maintain a building than a future. Shame hung in the air between them, a fourth silent presence. It was the common denominator, the currency in which their strange gifts had been paid. With a shared, grim resolve, they moved to the small storage closet where the drawing supplies were kept. The assignment box, a simple, lidded pine cube, sat on a shelf. Mara lifted it down, its lightness already telling a story. She set it on the table and removed the lid. It was empty. No folded slips, no leftover scraps, just bare, sanded wood, except for one thing. Centered perfectly at the bottom, as if placed with ritual care, was a single, fresh slip of white paper. Tom reached in, his hand steady despite the tremor in his breath, and lifted it out. He unfolded it. 3 words were written there in a neat, elegant script that seemed neither masculine nor feminine, but simply precise. The giving has just begun. The paper slipped from Tom's fingers, fluttering back into the box like a fallen leaf. In the stark light, the words seemed to pulse. The empty box was not a dead end, it was a promise. The drawing was over. The real exchange was now underway, and they, with their secrets laid bare between them, were no longer participants. They were the next gifts on the list. The slip of paper was a taunt, but it was also a clue. The metallic red wrap was a manufactured product, not homemade. Someone had to have bought it. In a town as small as Silverpine, that meant only one place could have stocked something so distinctive. Wexler's Novelties and Sundries, a cluttered, dusty shop on the edge of town that had been boarded up for over a decade. Old man Wexler had died the winter after the last major blizzard, and no one had ever bothered to reopen the place. It stood as a relic, its windows dark, its sign creaking in the wind. The trio moved through the twilight, the snow crunching under their boots. The walk to the outskirts felt like leaving the known. World behind, the houses grew sparse, then disappeared, giving way to skeletal trees and fields buried under seamless white. The shop sat at a lonely fork in the road, a two-story wooden structure that leaned slightly, as if weary from holding its memories. The porch sagged. One of the boarded-up windows had a slat missing, a dark gap like a missing tooth. Tom produced a crowbar from his coat, a tool he'd retrieved from his car. The sound of splintering wood was shockingly loud in the silent dusk. With a groan, the old door gave way, releasing a puff of air that was cold, but carried the ghostly scent of mothballs, dust, and something sweetly chemical like old perfume. They stepped into a tomb of forgotten merriment. Weak gray light filtered through the gaps in the boards, illuminating a surreal landscape. Shelves were crammed with dusty joke glasses, faded party hats, and limp streamers. A rack of novelty ties, patterned with ducks and martinis, stood sentinel near the counter. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for years, but not everything. At the rear of the shop, behind the main counter, was a storeroom. Its door was ajar. Clara's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, landing on a sight that made her gasp. Stacked neatly on metal shelves were dozens of rolls of wrapping paper. All of them were the same shimmering metallic red. The grid-like texture was visible even in the dim light. This was the source. Mara moved to a large, ledger-filled bookcase against the far wall. The volumes were thick, bound in cracked black leather. She pulled one down, dust exploding into the air. She opened it. The pages were not sales records. They were handwritten accounts, each entry dated, each detailing a secret Santa event in Silverpine. December 19, 1978, the exchange at the Miller farm. Gifts of revealed infidelity and petty theft delivered. Subject, Harold Miller. Outcome missing, presumed lost in storm. The giver sustains. December 22. 1991, the church basement exchange. Gifts of embezzlement and perjury delivered. Subject, the leaner Shaw. Outcome, found deceased, apparent suicide. The giver strengthens. Page after page, ledger after ledger, stretching back to the 1920s. Each entry told the same story. A holiday gift exchange, the arrival of impossible, secret-revealing presents wrapped in distinctive paper, followed by a tragedy. A disappearance. A death. The name the giver was on every page, not as a participant, but as a beneficiary. The final line was always a notation of nourishment. The giver feeds. The giver grows. The cycle holds. Tom stumbled back from the shelf, his face ashen. It's not a person, he whispered, the truth coiling around them in the cold air. It's a thing, a hunger. It feeds on the guilt, on the fear that comes after the secret is out. The pieces locked into a horrific whole. The giver was a parasitic entity, a presence woven into the fabric of the town's tradition. It manipulated the drawing, guided the gifts, and harvested the emotional turmoil that followed. The secrecy was the soil, the revealed shame was the crop, and the resulting tragedy, the ultimate gift of silence from a victim, was the harvest that cemented the cycle, leaving the town haunted but oblivious, ready to repeat the ritual the following year. A soft rustle came from the main shop floor, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. They froze, their breaths held. Clara swung her flashlight beam back through the storeroom door. There in the center of the dusty aisle between the racks of novelties, where nothing had been moments before, sat a gift. It was tall and rectangular, wrapped in the now familiar metallic red paper. A single tag was tied to the bow. Tom's name was written on it. His legs moved as if independent of his will, carrying him forward. He knelt and tore the paper away, the sound obscenely cheerful in the grim silence. It was a real estate sign, a professional, sturdy form. Sales sign, the kind he used every day. The post was neatly attached. The white panel was pristine. In bold, black letters it read, AB or an ATHY price, your sole listing date. Tomorrow. He dropped it as if it were white-hot. The sign clattered on the wooden floor, the sound echoing through the hollow shop. Tomorrow. The entity had moved from revealing his past to announcing his future. It was not just feeding on his old guilt anymore, it was marking him for the harvest. The dusty air seemed to thicken, growing heavier, colder. The shadows in the corners of the shop deepened, cooling with intent. The giver knew they were here. It had left them a history of its feasts, and now it had delivered a bill of sale. The investigation was over. They were no longer hunters. They were the prey, and the chase was coming to an end. Panic was a live wire in their veins, snapping and sparking as they fled the oppressive silence of Wexler's shop. The walk back to the heart of Silverpine was a blind sprint. Through a gathering darkness, the sign with Tom's name burning in his mind, the ledger's grim histories echoing in Mara's and Clara's, they had to warn the others. They had to break the cycle before the tomorrow on that sign arrived. They burst into the community hall, shouting for anyone who might be inside, their voices raw against the vast, empty space. But the hall was deserted, the chairs still stacked from the drawing night, the single work light they'd left on casting long, skeletal shadows. As they stood panting in the center of the room, a new sound rose to meet their frantic calls, not a voice, but the low, gathering moan of the wind outside. Through the high windows, they watched as the clear twilight was devoured by a fresh, boiling wall of white. The blizzard had returned with vengeful force, swallowing the town whole in a matter of minutes. The phone lines they knew would already be dead. They were isolated, the three of them, in the very chamber where it had all begun. It was then that they saw the box. It materialized not with a sound, but with a sudden, solid presence, as if the space in the center of the room had simply decided to condense into an object. One moment, the worn floorboards were bare. The next, they supported a large, ornate crate of dark, polished wood, banded with tarnished silver. It was a coffin for a doll or a shrine for a relic. The air around it grew perceptibly colder, drawing the warmth from their skin. The tag of heavy parchment was tied to one silver band with a black ribbon. Clara was the one who stepped close enough to read it, her breath hitching. For Mara, the final gift. Mara approached, her librarian's composure a thin veneer over primal terror. Her hands, usually so steady, shook as she untied the ribbon. The silver bands released with soft, metallic sighs, and the lid of the box lifted without her touch, swinging silently inward on unseen hinges. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a wooden figure. It was a sculpture of breathtaking, unsettling artistry, carved from a single piece of aged oak. It was Mara. Every detail was captured. The precise wave of her hair tied in its habitual bun, the lines of her practical cardigan, the slight forward lean of her posture as if perpetually listening. But the face, while perfectly her, was a horror. The eyes were not carved. They were deep, hollow voids that seemed to tunnel into infinite darkness. The mouth was a serene, closed line, offering no scream, no prayer, only silent acceptance. A deafening thud echoed through the hall as the main door slammed shut, followed by the sharp, definitive clicks of every lock engaging simultaneously. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, and died, plunging them into a deep gray gloom lit only by the emergency exit signs, which now glowed a sickly, pulsating red. Then the whispering began. It did not come from the box, nor from the shadows. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air. Like a toxic gas, a chorus of faint, dry voices speaking in perfect, chilling unison. You have given names, you have given secrets, you have given fear. Now we give the gift of silence. The temperature plummeted. Frost laced across the windows in intricate, frantic patterns. The whispering voice coiled around Mara, palpable pressure. The cycle must hold. The town must forget, yet remember in its bones. A life given freely in the season of giving seals the pact. Your silence, Mara, will be the keystone. Your guilt for choices made, for futures redirected, is the anchor. We claim it. We claim you. The hollow eyes of the wooden figure seemed to deepen, becoming vortices that pulled at the very light in the room. Mara felt a terrible, cold suction, not on her body, but on her essence, a drawing out through her breath, through the memory of her signature on that fateful grant form, through every quiet, pragmatic choice that had favored stone and mortar over soft, hopeful hearts. Entity did not want her death. It wanted her extinction within the ritual, her transformation into a permanent, silent part of its machinery. She was to become the ultimate gift, a sacrifice wrapped in tradition, whose absence would haunt the town just enough to keep the guilt fertile, but not enough to break the spell. Tom and Clara cried out, rushing toward her, but an invisible, jellied wall of air solidified between them, holding them back. They could only watch, pounding against nothing, as Mara stood transfixed before her own effigy, the whispering voices weaving her secret history into a shroud, the giver's ancient hunger finally moving from implication to claim. The final present had been delivered, and it was unwrapping itself. Dawn broke over Silverpine not with a gentle light, but with a pale, exhausted glare, as if the sun itself were weary from the night's events. The storm had scoured itself out, leaving the town buried under a fresh, unblemished quilt of snow that sparkled. With a cruel innocence, the first search party, organized when Tom and Clara failed to return home, found the community hall's doors unlocked and slightly ajar, swaying in a bitter breeze. Inside, they discovered Tom and Clara unconscious on the cold floorboards near the stage. Their bodies curled as if against a deep chill, their skin ice-cold to the touch, but their pulses steady and slow. Between them, centered perfectly on the floor, sat the ornate wooden box. Its lid was closed. The silver bands were secure. It was empty. Of Mara there was no trace. No footprints led away from the hall in the fresh snow. No car was missing. Her coat still hung on the rack in the library, her half-finished tea cold on her desk. It was as if she had been plucked from the fabric of the world, the threads neatly clipped and tucked away. The only evidence, if it could be called that, was the wooden figure. It was not in the box, nor clutched in Tom's or Clara's hands. A volunteer checking the hall's donation box for spare blankets found it. The small, carved effigy of Mara lay cradled there amongst old mittens and scarves, its hollow eyes staring upward. It was placed with care, a deliberate offering. The town, shaken to its core, treated it not as a clue, but as a totem of collective trauma. In a silent agreement, they buried it in the town archives, sealed in a cardboard box marked MISC, holiday decorations. They tried to move on. The year that followed was a year of quiet nerves and averted eyes. The secret Santa tradition was suspended by unspoken consensus. The community hall saw no festive gatherings. People gave gifts openly, with names attached, the magic of anonymity now forever poisoned. Tom sold no houses. He left real estate and took over his brother's struggling plow business, trading in secrets for snow-packed driveways. Clara took a leave from the library, citing stress, and spent her days in her garden, her hands in the dirt, trying to ground herself in something real. They rarely spoke, bound by a shared horror that words could only cheapen. Then, as the air turned sharp and the first flurries of a new winter dusted the rooftops, Tom felt it, a compulsive magnetic pull. It began as a restlessness, a twitch in his hands. It grew into a pervasive thought, a voice that felt like his own but colder, whispering that the tradition was important, that the town needed it, that to ignore it was to invite something worse. He fought it for a week, waking in a sweat, until the morning he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the hollow, determined look in his own eyes. He organized the exchange again. He sent out simple emails, made a few phone calls. The responses were muted, fearful, but they came. A deeper, older instinct than fear was at work, a tribal memory of ritual, a superstitious belief that participation was safer than refusal. On the appointed evening, a smaller, quieter group gathered in the community hall. The cheer was forced. The laughter thin and quickly dying. Tom stood where Mara had stood, holding a new, plain wooden box for the names. His hands were steady. His smile felt carved from wood. One by one, they approached and drew a folded slip. No one met his gaze. When the last person had taken their name, Tom was left alone with the box. According to the old rules, the organizer drew last, ensuring no one was left out. His heart was a dull, heavy drum in his chest. He reached into the box, his fingers brushing the few remaining slips. He took one. He unfolded it slowly under the stark fluorescent lights. The name written there was not in his handwriting, nor in any familiar script. The letters were elegant, precise, and ink black. Tom Abernathy. His blood turned to ice water. The air left his lungs in a silent rush. The hall seemed to tilt, the walls pressing in. He wasn't holding an assignment. He was holding a verdict. The cycle was not broken. It had simply been waiting, hibernating through the year. Quiet dread, Mara had been the claimed sacrifice, the gift of silence that sealed the pact. Now, with the tradition resurrected, the entity needed a new facilitator, a new reluctant heart to oversee the drawing, to handle the names, to be the human face of its ancient hunger. It had chosen him. The giver was not giving him a present, it was giving him a purpose. He was no longer just a recipient of terror. He was to become its harbinger. The folded paper burned in his hand. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall, thick and silent, beginning to bury Silverpine once more.